Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Are you having a good time? I know, I can tell. This is so exciting because this is a continuation of a conversation that we're always having on
Yes,
Twitter.
that's right. Yep.
In the DMs, talking a lot of trash, which is how it should be, I think.
Yeah.
I really wanted to ask you because, to me, there's been a turning point in the way we talk about gentrification. And I give a lot of credit to you for that, in part, because...
Whole team right up front
definitely.
here. Yep.
Yeah, a lot of people for sure.
Yep.
There was a long time when the conversation about gentrification was pretty much like, you know, it's terrible that it's happening, I guess, but hey, cupcakes.
Yeah.
You know,
Hey.
organic cupcakes.
Yep.
And that was true on WNYC a lot, and I love WNYC. So I say that's a critique out of love, but it was like, first it was nothing, and it was happening everywhere, but no one was talking about it. No one in public spaces. And then they were talking about it, but in a very kind of like, it's all this even playing field, and let's just have this cute little dialogue where there's this side and that side. And now, and I think the people that are living through it are like, wait, this is a huge human rights violation that's really happening. This is communities being destroyed. Thank you. You can clap. That's cool. Communities being completely destroyed. And I don't think that the true weight of it was really coming through in the coverage until you came along. So can you talk about what that's been like for you, both experiencing gentrification as a human being living in Brooklyn and being on the front line of having the public conversation about it?
Absolutely. And I think it is one of the biggest challenges with this project was everybody is talking about gentrification, but nobody is really understanding what it means. And what we wanted to do was create a podcast and a audio experience where you experience the gentrification as people were experiencing it. And so to do that, we have an amazing team, and we went out and found stories and reported deeply enough so that we actually disappeared. So that actually the people who were experiencing it were the ones who had the agency to tell their stories. And that was a really a profound experience for me, because I really didn't know how we were going to do it, how we were going to make it interesting. And I'm talking as someone who lives in Williamsburg, the epicenter, and just disclaimer here, and I always say this, like, we don't live in Williamsburg for the cool factor. We never did. We live on the uncool side of the BQE, because my husband teaches in the Bronx, and we love Brooklyn. And if we lived any further out, you see, I'd do this thing where I'm not. But now, as it turns out, there's nowhere else to develop on the cool side of Williamsburg, so we're being pushed out. We just got our notice a couple of months ago, and we have to move and leave the apartment where we've lived for 10 years. My son has lived there his whole life. And so, it's interesting. After reporting and being on this team for the last 2+ months, I thought, I'm prepared. I can go out there and we can look for a place, and I know what we're doing. And we just started looking over the past weekend, and it was horrifying. It was truly horrifying. Everything that we reported, everything that we heard that's what's happening. I mean, from the racial tension from block to block, which you can cut with a knife, to the brokers or whoever saying, well, it's a 4th floor walk up with, whatever, but for this neighborhood, right. Do you know what it is to live in this neighborhood in Bed-Stuy right now? And so it's been a really interesting experience, and a really kind of heartbreaking one, actually.
Yeah, and that heartbreaking thing, I appreciate you saying it exactly like that, because you're right, we get very, even when we're giving the conversation the weight and the depth that it needs, we get very intellectual about it. And the truth is that on top of all those horrifying numbers and then the horrifying rent numbers and everything else, there is just an emotional level to it that also has been missing from the public dialogue about it. And as we were talking about, it's a question of representation, both in the actual faces in the neighborhood and then the faces who are telling the stories in the neighborhood.
That's right. We were talking earlier on Twitter about diversity and gentrification being sort of the same thing, right? Which is basically that, the good ones are cherry-picked. And then the rest of the neighborhood or the rest of the office space or the rest of the whatever stays mostly white.
And even you can tell in the way that we had the conversation, because the number of times that I've heard this expression when people are talking about gentrification and they go, oh, first it's the artist. And it's always like, wait, there's a huge act of erasure in that simple statement, right? Because they don't say the white artists, but they mean the white artists, because there's always been artists in the hood.
That's right.
There have always been artists in the hood. And to not say that, and to act like suddenly there's artists when really what you mean is suddenly there's white artists, that to me really speaks about the whiteness of the conversation itself.
That's right. I mean, I think of Joshua Jacobo from our second episode, who is an artist and who has lived in this neighborhood and who acknowledges. I mean, I think for me, working on the podcast, when we met him and heard from him was when it was really like a gut punch. Like, for him to articulate, people want to move into this neighborhood because of what we have made. And what our community is. It's appealing, it's gritty, it's urban, it's cultural, it's whatever. It's artistic, right?
Yes.
In some ways. But then the folks who move in end up reconfiguring the landscape through a white lens.
I'll never forget an image that I actually saw back when I was working as a paramedic, and it was a memorial mural. And this is I wrote a book called Shadow Shaper, which is a lot about memorial murals coming to life and the magic of them. And part of it was because of this one image it was a man's face, against a wall, and someone had clearly bought the building, and they put up a fence that cut right into the middle of his face. And it was that really broke my heart, to see that. And these questions. It's such a difficult conversation because it's systemic, like we've been talking about all night, and it's personal, like we've been talking about all night. It's racial, but when we start to have the race conversation, someone jumps in and goes, yeah, but class, which is the history of race conversations in America. So it's like, where do we even begin?
Where do we even begin to do what?
Well, we've already begun, I guess.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
I guess it's like, where do we go next?
I mean, I think that, again, what we hope to do with this podcast, and what I think that we feel we have from what we've heard from people, is that it's a start in terms of hearing how people are experiencing it and using it as a tool to talk and to show up and to press forward. And as we have experienced tonight, and as we've experienced in the podcast, and probably in many of the conversations that you've had with your neighbors and friends, there's a lot of discomfort, there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of human emotion, which, if you identify it and if you own it, means we're making progress. So I think that what we do is we keep feeling those things, and we insert them into the conversations. Yeah. And we ride it out. Yeah.
And I want to put the word rage in there too, among the emotions, because just listening to Akila's piece, that was one thing I felt, and that's another one of those parts of the conversation I think that doesn't get a lot of play, is that there's rage, and sometimes it's hard to even say it. As people of color, the second we express rage, people are preparing for riots. But that's a really valid and real critique to, or just a reaction rather, to people getting moved out and to communities being dispersed. I don't think we grant community itself enough power in the conversation a lot, because especially for communities of color, generally just people who don't get the same resources in the United States, community is the anchor. It's like how we survive.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the other thing that we discovered through our reporting and through this process, is that, people a lot of times who move into these historically Black and brown neighborhoods think this is a lovely neighborhood, we can bring something to it. They don't think that at the core is a community. Right. Whether or not it is an historically violent or drug-riddled or whatever kind of moral assignment is made on these communities, there is still at core a community and livelihood where people have feelings and family and jobs and ideas and imagination and all of those things. And I think that is what often gets, sort of sold short.
And even what that word community means, right? Because a lot of times I hear people being like, "Oh, well, they're making the community better." You mean the buildings? Like, because obviously you're not talking about the people, because the people are gone, right?
Yeah, I mean, we actually had people in
Right.
the podcast say, like a landlord or a broker say, the better people come in, and yeah, you remember that. And then this young 14-year-old who I spoke with in episode 7, a young black girl who's trying to figure out what her responsibility and her role is, and lives in a really lovely part of Bed-Stuy, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
But that, I think, in my experience as a complicated, kind of messy person,
Yeah, well,
is where you make the most interesting headway.
Right, and that's exactly it. And I notice urban fantasy is my genre, right? And I always think of it as a very gentrified genre, because while in publishing, urban tends to be code speak for black or brown, the urban section of the bookstore, when you put fantasy on the end, suddenly it's all white. Right. And I don't know why, but there's a lot of mostly white urban fantasy writers.
Because white people can fantasize.
Can fantasize, right? And it's like, wow, there's a lot of truth there, because there is this fantasy of the city, right? Yeah. And in that genre, we tend to see very extreme versions of the city. We don't get to have that complicated conversation that you're talking about. It'll either be like this hellscape where there's like babies shooting each other and shooting up on the corner and all kinds of terrible things, and then werewolves having sex and whatever. Oh my God. I can say that, right? Or it's like the happy provincial, and all white, and you're like, what city is this? Like, what is happening? Where are these places? And the truth is, neither of those, actually exist. They overlap on so many levels. So it's like, can we have this complicated conversation on the air, in the public forums, in fantasy fiction? It seems like we can't, but I'm glad that we are now.
I think we have to.
We have to, exactly.
I think we have to, and I think that what it requires is a new, is a different kind of language.
Yes.
I think that that power is really within the language, and within creating language and embracing language and hearing things differently, and so that they don't become these kind of washover words like gentrification and diversities, but that we hear in someone's voice. Again, I refer to Corinne. This 14-year-old girl who lives in Stuyvesant Heights, and I will tell you, if you've listened to, you've heard me say, it's like a wonderland. It's like a magical, gorgeous, stunning block of black people and gorgeous homes. But she was talking about how she's really super into aesthetics, but that's just her, and that a lot of folks probably aren't or might not be. But the way that she presented that sentence and that thought, and that was so brave, I thought, and so important and essential to who she was, and that she could bring that to the conversation in a way that her peers might really need to hear it. Right. Especially when she's talking to her white peers who say to her, just by being here, we make the block more beautiful, or we make the city more beautiful. That's right. That's right.
Said it to her face.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I don't even have anything to say after that. You just took all the words out of my mouth.
I think we are actually running out of time.
Yes. Well, I hope I wish you luck in your gentrification journey, your anti-gentrification journey, and your apartment hunting journey. And
thank you. And thank you.
It's really been a pleasure.
Likewise.